Naomi Huzovicova is a passionate and talented ancestral cook, a food story discoverer, and an amazing photographer. She has lived and cooked up Slovakian food culture for 17 years now, and we're grateful to her for sharing so much of its uniqueness with us. In this episode, we open up the rich world that is Slovakian food. Naomi explains what it is and, importantly, why it is like that. You'll get a history lesson via our talk of ferments, bread and fats, and you'll get to know two simple dishes that represent Slovakian food that you'll want to cook up in your kitchens right away. Plum brandy, deep-fried treats, 20-litre vats of sauerkraut, bone soups, offal sausages, it's all here. Your mouth will be watering before the end of this one. Welcome to the Ancestral Kitchen podcast with Alison, a European town dweller in central Italy, and Andrea, living on a newly created family farm in northwest Washington State, USA. Pull up a chair at the table and join us as we talk about eating, cooking, and living with ancient ancestral food wisdom in a modern world kitchen. Hello and welcome to another episode of Ancestral Kitchen podcast. I am flying solo in terms of hosting today. Andrew is with us in spirit, but I have a guest. Hello, Naomi. Thank you for coming back. Hello.
Glad to be here.
We talked to Naomi previously on episode 23. She lives in Slovakia, and we did an episode together focusing on traditional Slovakian pig butchery, which was absolutely fascinating. So go back and have a listen to that one if you haven't. I wanted to get Naomi back on the podcast because in that previous episode, we touched briefly on traditional Slovakian dishes, and they just sound amazing. And if you go to Naomi's blog, which we'll link, you'll see how many just gorgeous looking peasant food style warming dishes there are. And so in this episode, we are going to focus in on the traditional foods of Slovakia and talk about some dishes and hopefully make you hungry. So before we start, I just want to say thank you to the patrons who are supporting the podcast. If you're interested in supporting us and getting back the goodies that Andrea and I produce, head over to patreon.com/Ancestral Kitchen podcast. Okay, so Naomi, let me ask you in true Ancestral Kitchen podcast style, what was the last thing you ate?
Well, I didn't manage to eat breakfast yet. Oh, no. So the last thing I had was dinner last night. And it was actually in preparation for this podcast. So I made the lard crackling spread and get a very simple supper. We have a busy day of music lessons and things. So I came back late. So I managed to steam some broccoli and throw some sesame seeds on it. Toasted sesame seeds, and some sourdough bread with crackling spread, and that was it.
That sounds delicious. So Naomi's talking about the crackling spread because what we're going to do is after we finish recording, we're going to head over to the Patreon feed and we're going to film together Naomi cooking up some Slovakian goodies in her kitchen. So that's what she was making the crackling spread for. I know because I've made that myself based on some advice you gave me that it's absolutely delicious. And also, I love sesame seeds with broccoli as well. I've tried that before and the two flavours seem to go really nicely, don't they?
It's something that my mom always did. Broccoli, she would often put like a squeeze of lemon on it. I didn't do that, but like an olive oil instead of butter. And yeah.
Nice. The broccoli is just coming back into season here. We've missed it.
I bought it. There's a farm nearby that I can buy produce from. I don't think it's not organic, but it is local and fresh. So he just opens up twice a week to sell produce, and I got something there.
I really miss broccoli when I don't have it. I just, like, for the rest of the summer, I enjoy all the other produce, but when the broccoli comes back, I have a little celebration inside. Broccoli's back. Yay.
Yeah, but I like cooked broccoli. I've never been a fan of raw broccoli. You know, there'd be like a vegetable platter with broccoli on it. I'm like, meh. But cauliflower is okay raw, but not a fan of raw broccoli. But I do love it, like a creamy broccoli soup. So good.
Yeah, I agree. Cool. So your music lessons, what we maybe listeners, if they didn't listen to the previous episode, don't know is that you have 4 children. So you are a very busy mum, and also blogging and working in food. So there's going to be lots to share and talk about. First of all, I think I'm going to ask you a really basic question, because not all of us have geography as our strongest point. Can you tell us all where Slovakia is, so we can understand kind of how it fits into the influences around it?
So Slovakia is a small Central European country. Some people are quite adamant that they're not Eastern Europe, but Central Europe. It's surrounded by, on various sides, Austria, Czech Republic, little piece with Ukraine, Poland, and Hungary. And it's kind of a long, narrow country. I mean, long is a relative term. It takes maybe, I don't know, to drive from one side to the other is maybe 8 hours, although that is a lot. Not all of that is highway. So you get 3/4 of the country really quickly, and the last part is really slow because there's no highway. You have to slow down to go through little villages and stuff. But
is it really populated, or are there not very many people living there?
About 5 million.
Okay.
And the urban centers are not huge. Like the biggest city is the capital, which is Bratislava, and there's, I think, 500,000 there. So it's not a big city.
And then whereabouts do you live? Do you live in a city, or do you live out in the country?
I live in a village, maybe 3,000 people, on about an hour from Bratislava. And it's actually a great spot because to the south of us, it's flat as far as you can see. But right behind my house are the Carpathian Hills. And so they're not mountains, but they're hilly. And, from my door, I can quickly go for a walk in the forest, which is really nice.
I've seen so many pictures on your Instagram of beautiful walks. It's absolutely inspiring scenery. And that must influence the food a lot, which is where we're going to head. So before we dive into the food, tell everyone why you're in Slovakia, because you're not Slovakian, are you?
No, I grew up in Canada in a off-the-grid farm with my father's from Japan. And I moved here, now it's coming up 18 years at Christmas. And yeah, met my husband going to university in the States, and came here. My last semester was in Austria at a study abroad program. And seeing as I was right next door, I came across to see what the country was like. And here we've been mostly ever since.
Wow. Okay. That's nice. And with your 4 children now, so you're well and truly, after 18 years nearly, it must feel like home to you. Is that right?
It's hard to say because my language is definitely limiting. And even though many things to me now are normal, I still have not views, but maybe habits or ways of interacting socially that are quite different than everyone else. So, and it's in a village, Slovakia is a very family-based society still. In a city, not so much. There's, lots of people have moved there for work, but in a small village, most people have known each other all their lives, the family, and they have their family right around. So it makes it sometimes a little harder to break into the society, local culture.
Yeah, I resonate with that. I mean, I haven't been in Italy as long as you've been in Slovakia by any means. we've probably been here almost 8 years in total. My language is reasonable, but it's not the language of a native. And obviously, my husband Rob is English as well, so it's very difficult to identify where home is, and it's always kind of a work in progress because some things show you, like you said, that you're actually very different, whereas other times you feel part of it. So it's a big mismatch for me, for sure.
Yeah, and Slovaks in particular, or maybe this area of the world, Central Europe, what was once behind the Iron Curtain, it can it takes a long time to get to know people. They're kind of with friends, with relatives, with people that they know, they're very friendly, very loyal, very helpful, but it takes quite a while to actually meet someone. Actually, it's funny because I work at a restaurant, and my boss he's Slovak, but he worked in the States for over 20 years. And so we have and the other people who work there, the front staff, we're all very friendly. And it's happened actually on more than one occasion. We'll be smiling at people. I'll walk past a table and smile. Just the other day, I walked past a table, smiled at a customer. She turned to the people she was with, and she's like, "Everyone here smiles," because it is very unusual to smile at a stranger here.
Because you've been abroad.
Yeah, because the owner's been abroad, and for me, that's just how you interact with customers or clients. And I've also actually read, I don't know if it's theory or true, that in countries where there's a lot of people from different countries, body language is your common language. So there's a lot more smiling and that kind of body language in common. Whereas in countries where there's not so much multiple ethnicities, that it's much more language based. So they don't.
Yeah, that makes sense completely. I remember when I went to Russia, the language was completely alien to me. I didn't speak any of it, and of course the alphabet's completely different. Mm-hmm. So it was like just unknown to me, and yet that made me realise how important body language was, because the people who I was around who didn't speak any English either, I could communicate so much with them using body language. And so I can completely understand how a study you might have read would say that becomes much more important when there's lots of different people around, for sure.
Yeah, like in Canada and America, at least that's what I have the most experience with. You when you meet someone, you smile. Whereas here, nobody smiles, but it's in a village, maybe not in the city, but in a village, especially with the older people, it's a hallmark of good manners to say good day when you enter a small store, or even passing an older person on the street, to say, and children, like I have a friend who's really strict with her son, like you meet, especially, and the younger person has to greet the older person first. So like you meet someone and you say good day. That's hallmark of politeness.
That happens here too. And that was kind of a bit of a shock when I first came here, because everyone says good day to everyone when they walk in the store, like you said. Mm-hmm. And I've got so used to it. Now, when I went back to visit England this year, I walked into a shop and I felt really awkward, because the person who was behind the cash desk didn't look at me and say hello, and I didn't say hello, and I was just like, there's something wrong here. I need to greet them.
So cold, so rude.
Yeah, exactly, weird. Okay, let's talk about food. So tell us what the ingredients and the techniques and the kind of the farming and the kitchens, what epitomizes Slovakian food?
Epitomizes, I would say, a full belly.
Okay.
Feeling like you've had a really good meal. It's comfort food, peasant food, what they could grow. I mean, I was actually thinking about it a little more, reading a little more, and the food of the country is so influenced by the politics of its history. I don't know, should I dive into that a little bit?
Yeah, go. Yeah, no, please.
So originally at some point, for many years, Slovakia was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And the Slovaks were the peasants, and mostly Hungarians were the aristocracy. So there's castles all over the country. Many people claim that Slovakia has the most castles per capita, because there really are. There's ruins everywhere, but it was mostly the Hungarians who lived in them. And one family would be in charge or own a huge swath of land. And when I've gone to maybe an exhibition of a castle ruin, a particularly important one, and there'll be something about the food, which of course is the first thing that I read. And their recipes are a lot of, from the Middle Ages, lots of meats, lots of spices, those kind of all over much of Europe had a lot of what we would think of sweet spices like cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, those kinds of things were in savory dishes. And that existed here, but for a Slovak peasant, they didn't have access to any of that. It was far beyond their means.
Okay.
So the Slovaks themselves were subsistent farmers. Couple chickens, pig, cow, and lots of people, and it still works like this, is out just outside of the town. People had kind of little plots, and they would grow various grains, cabbages, potatoes, what have you. Actually, potatoes, it was mostly a grain-based growing. And then when potatoes came into the country and started being growing here, they really took off, especially in the kind of mountainous areas or the hilly areas, because the soil wasn't as good. Okay. And it was colder. So it was much more suited to growing. You could get a lot more calorie out of a potato per square footage area. Yeah. And in the West, of course, they grew potatoes and ate potatoes, but it continued to be more of a grain. They continued to grow a lot more grains.
And was the grains wheat, or was there rye and oats and other kind of grains?
Yeah. Buckwheat, millet, wheat was a big one. Barley, I think those were rye. Those were the main ones.
Okay.
And one lady that I knew, there used to be, in this town where there is not a single mill, there used to be 7 mills. Everyone took their mills, or took their own sacks of grain to be processed.
How long ago was that? When were those 7 mills active, and when did they not work anymore?
They started. Well, that's part of the politics. Is they started to be shut down during communism, because you couldn't have your own business, and everything was aggregated during communism.
Okay. When did the communist era start in Slovakia?
So there's the Austro-Hungarian Empire, then there was the 2 world wars, and which, in terms of food, a lot of devastation, just infrastructure, land, people, not as many people not as many men, especially to harvest and farm. So there was quite a stretch when people remember being hungry. And so after the Second World War, basically, give or take a year, communism took over. And throughout its reign until 1989, and throughout that time, it fluctuated in how strict it was. But at the beginning, it was quite strict. And in terms of food, and I never really thought about this, but in terms of food, taking the time to prepare your food and to enjoy your food was a very bourgeoisie activity. Food became very utilitarian, or I mean, the idea from the state anyway, was that food was very utilitarian. So people had to eat in order to function, to have a full belly, so nobody was rebelling. And that was basically it. There was no thoughts about nutrition, no thoughts about quality or the taste. Of course, people wanted food that tasted good, but there was not really this idea of new innovations. A lot of foods were then restricted because, of course, you couldn't import anything from the West.
Yeah,
a few imports from fellow communist countries from the East, maybe some curry or something, but yeah.
So your husband's parents, they basically experienced that. Is that the generation and the generation before that?
Yeah, and my husband was 13 when it ended, so he remembers this.
Okay.
And there was, in some ways, there was a lot of industrialization that happened when they took over. So and apartment buildings being built,
yeah.
Which gave people a place to live after the war. But so on the one hand, you had kind of maybe what we would consider higher living standards. There's work in factories and more food available if you didn't grow it yourself. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, there was a lot of problems with food shortages, not having enough people. One effect of communism is that you help the people that you know. And so my husband remembers standing in line and waiting, the bread or the meats shipment or the delivery was coming, and you went and you lined up, and then in order to make sure that you got your allotted quota of however much. And if you were not shop owner, they didn't really, if you were the shopkeeper, I guess, of say a vegetable place, you got the one shipment of oranges in the winter, and you kind of kept them under the counter, and you gave them to your friends and family to make sure that they got it, and then everybody else would get it.
So the idea of people having a space where they're growing, those kind of more colder type climate vegetables, the cabbages and the potatoes, and potentially having chickens and pigs. During that period, could they eat those, or did they have to give those to the state then for it to be redistributed? How did that work?
Cows were taken away, which just boggles my mind. Cows were taken away. Pigs, chickens were not. Maybe there might have been a time when you had to give a certain amount of food or produce, but I haven't heard about that much. But it was definitely a sign of rebellion if you tried to keep your cows. And I've heard of, people who had a couple of cows and they said, no, I'm not. And it was, they were persecuted for that.
Why did they take the cows away?
Because then they put it in central farms. So where my husband grew up, behind the village, on somebody else's property. So then all the land belonged to everyone. So they just said, okay, I don't know, put their finger on a spot. I don't know, maybe there was water there or something. It didn't matter who it used to belong to, because now it belonged to everyone. So they picked a spot, built a farm. And in terms of farm, it was an industrial farm. So it's not, cows grazing on open pastures. Yeah. It's buildings where the cow maybe goes outside in a little yard. And then you had to buy your milk, which is just seems so unjust.
Yeah.
And but also people who lived in apartments. I mean, it's still, even today, there's a lot of villages and grandmas have big gardens, even more so back then, because you had to do those things in order to survive. You couldn't rely on there being, partly it was the history of that's what everyone had done, but also you couldn't rely on things being in the stores. So survival meant that you had a couple apricot trees or a big garden, and you process the produce, or your pigs, chickens. But even people who lived in the city, it's very common that there's around the city, there were little garden areas. So they might or might not, I think probably less in terms of animal husbandry, like pigs and chickens, but definitely produce. I remember the first time I saw it, we were driving on the outskirts of a city, and I was looking at the side of the hill, like, what is this? Because there were these little kind of shacks, cabins. And I asked my husband, like, are these the slums or something? Like, what is this? He said, no, it's a garden area. So people on the weekend, Monday to Friday, they worked in their factory. And then on the weekends, they kind of fled to either the hills, the mountains, or to their gardens. And and then you hear stories of people even who, did a pig butchering in their apartment, which,
gosh,
yes. But they would have a pig out in their garden area, and they brought home the animal and then processed it in their little tiny Soviet kitchen.
Wow. Okay.
This episode of Ancestral Kitchen is brought to you by Home Folk Roots. Home Folk Roots is an online membership community dedicated to living a simple life that is in harmony with the seasons. Members take on gentle challenges complete with ebooks and printables to help them stay focused on home and nature. They connect in a private forum and have the opportunity to participate in old-fashioned mail swaps and letter writing. Once a month, they get together for a live chat. At Home Folk Roots, they grow food, cook from scratch, use herbs for healing, take walks in nature, forage, craft, connect with their local communities, and share adventures in a judgment-free zone. They share photos, struggles, and successes to celebrate and encourage each other in an authentic, slow life connected to the earth. Join in spring and take 15% off the season's membership. Visit homespunseasonalliving.com/AKP to learn more and join. The link's in the show notes.
What about ferments? Because so many of the dishes that I've seen on your website include sauerkraut, and you said that cabbages were grown. Talk about how ferments were part of and have been part of the food culture of Slovakia.
So sauerkraut is the biggest one for sure. And that was a way of both preparing something for the winter that was easy to cook. It was already sliced, and you just had to throw it in a soup or a stew or fry it up or something. And also a way of preserving it. You had limited ways or limited space to keep a cabbage all winter. You have to have certain conditions and stuff. Cucumbers, small cucumbers, are often also fermented here. They don't stay as long in the winter, but you'll still sometimes find a grandma at a little marketplace with a jar of fermented cucumbers. And I remember my father-in-law saying that his mother had kind of an ongoing fermenting crock, and she would just throw anything in there. As stuff became, it started when the produce started, and then she would just kind of throw things in there as this gardening season went on and things ripened. But there's not a lot of innovation. Now the fermenting is sauerkraut with various spices or kimchi or all these. No. There was a few differences. I've had at one time, a lady she put like little green apples or yellow apples, I guess, in the sauerkraut, but there wasn't a lot of innovation. You just kind of did the same thing.
Yes, because it was needed to keep that produce and to keep going through the winter, I guess.
And
have food.
Yeah, and it was what was available. And also during communism, innovation was a very capitalist thing to do. It wasn't encouraged at all.
Yeah.
So,
What I think is interesting about the way that countries like Slovakia use sauerkraut is the fact that it's put into dishes that are cooked in large amounts. And, you know, the resurgence of fermented food in wealthy countries see sauerkraut as a raw thing that you put on the side of your plate in order to get those probiotics that are still alive. And coming across recipes that have real large amounts of sauerkraut, you know, the amount of sauerkraut that would take quite a long time for me to produce in and cooked for hours in a stew, it's something that, you know, is such a huge tradition in lots of countries, but it's not something that newcomers to sauerkraut and ferments are at all familiar with. And it's I find that really interesting.
Yeah, so making sauerkraut here, traditionally, you would call your kids, or you know, your grown kids or family, friends, and the wooden. I don't know if there's a word. I don't know. Do we have an English word for it? The it's like a slicer. It's like a wooden piece of wood with a blade across it. Mm-hmm. Put the cabbage on top in the little wooden square. One person runs the cabbage back and forth, and it slices it. Mm-hmm. Now, actually, right now, there's signs everywhere where you can buy already cut cabbage. Yeah. But I find it a little bit dry. I prefer to do it fresh because by the time I bought it once or twice, but by the time, you know, if they do it and then you get it home, and then by the time you actually get to it, so it's easier just to. I find it's not so dry to do it yourself, but it is more work. And and then you have they have a lot of these. Traditionally, they were wooden that they used for, especially for things like this, but these troughs, I guess. Mm-hmm. Then, of course, they're plastic, little tubs, and you mix your sauerkraut and salt, bay leaves, and maybe some allspice, and pack it into these pottery crocks, and they can get really big and really heavy. My mother-in-law would make them in ones that were about 20 liters, which is about 20 quarts. And I have a picture somewhere of the twins standing by them, and they're about the same size. The twins were maybe like 4 or 5. And so this year I'm going to make it. I'm just waiting for a free weekend. But I want to do smaller, like 2 smaller ones, because I don't have a basement that's easily accessible. You have to go down like a little trap door in the floor, and carrying 20 liters of sauerkraut. So
the sauerkraut was made once a year for the whole year, by the sound of it. Yeah. Okay, interesting. Now, the one of the dishes that you are going to show us on the Patreon video that we will record after we've talked is called strapachki, and that is an example of using the sauerkraut in a cooked dish, isn't it? Can you talk a little bit about strapachki for us?
Yeah, so it's a very simple dish. I love it. My husband always looks wondering at me like, why do you like this dish so much? It's definitely not his favorite, but traditionally it's made with the halushki, are a potato dumpling, and they don't have to be potatoes. You can make it with flour as well, but the traditional way is potato dumplings are specific, especially in from the central part of Slovakia, where potatoes were especially revered, grown. And you chop up some sauerkraut. You have these halushki, potato gnocchi, or spatzel, is kind of dumplings, noodles, and pan fry it with some sauerkraut and bacon. And the bacon here, you might be able to find sliced bacon, but here you buy bacon in a chunk, and you cut it so you can get really nice chunks of bacon instead of these little tiny thin crumbs. And you just pan fry it and make the halushki, pan fry it with some sauerkraut, and it's good. And I saw one time, I also saw it, I used to visit this nun kitchen, or a kitchen of a convent, and so she was making bigger portions, and so she did the same thing, but she put it in a deeper cookie sheet type thing and baked it. Stirred it a couple times, and so it was easier to make for a big group.
So it's just bacon and sauerkraut and these potato dumplings.
Yeah,
that's it.
And when you make the dumplings, actually, I'm experimenting a little bit more, and like, I have to make these more often because it's so easy. Pasta, I love the idea of homemade pasta, but by the time you roll, it's the rolling out and the cutting, and it just takes so much time. Yeah. And this is like, you whip up the dough. It's mostly potatoes grated finely on the fine holes of a grater. Grated potatoes, couple eggs, salt, and enough flour so it makes a looser than bread, but a little bit stiffer than cake.
Yeah. Okay.
And then they have, I've seen these sometimes they're also used for gnocchi or spätzle, but they call it a halushkar in here, a halushkar. And it's basically a thing with holes. Then you just pour the dough, you put the dough in it and scrape back and forth, and the dough just drips down. And then you end up with a type of pasta without having to do all the work of rolling and cutting.
Yeah. Nice. And so I'm imagining it tastes kind of filling because of the potato, that gives you that really filling. And then you've got the bacon, which is salty and fatty. And what does the sauerkraut give to the dish, that cooked sauerkraut? How does that change the potato and the fat flavors?
Well, anytime you cook sauerkraut, it mellows out, and it's not so acidic. So I always recommend, when people say like, "Oh, I made sauerkraut because I feel like I should, it's healthy, and now I don't know what to do with it." I always recommend cooking it because it's easier, especially if you're trying to introduce yourself or kids or spouses, significant others to eating sauerkraut. It can be too acidic for people just kind of getting used to it. So if you cook it, it mellows it and also softens it. And when it's together with, especially if you pair it with a carbohydrate like potatoes, it's that also kind of mellows it out. And yeah.
I'm looking forward to seeing you do that. So on the video, you're going to show us the dumplings, and you're going to show us a simpler version where you can just use potato without having to make it into a dumpling. Is that right?
I kind of forgot about the just potato part.
Okay. So we're going to do the dumplings, the proper one.
Well, not even the proper one. So I experimented with making sourdough dumplings because these halushki, they make potato dumplings, but halushki is a broader term that kind of means any kind. And you can also make just flour ones. They often will put it in soup. And actually really, if you don't have a halushki maker, I've seen women make them, and if you're practiced at it, you can get quite quick, but I'm nowhere near that. Is they just put the dough on a small cutting board and just cut the dough into the boiling water. So they kind of slice and flick.
Wow.
And someone practiced can get pretty quick at it. I'm not there yet.
That's just amazing when you see women like that. I mean, that's every culture, whatever it is, whether it's oat cakes or making kind of pasta shapes or making these dumplings, that the women just get so quick at it that you try and replicate it and you're like, oh, they're all fingers and thumbs. It doesn't work.
Yeah. No, exactly. And it's and they put this into a lot of soups. I mean, Slovaks are big soup eaters, and they'll often be these just flour halushki in soups. So I was with the idea of like ancestral kitchen and sourdough and, you know, like traditional ways of preparing, I prepared a few different, with a few different flours. Cause actually even now, if you go to the store, there's never just all purpose flour as there is in Canada and America. There's your finely ground and your more kind of rough ground, a coarse ground, like a semolina. So I tried a few different versions. So
I'm looking forward to seeing them. I wish I could taste them.
They're good, actually. I was impressed. They're not. One of them was, I'm not a very good experimenter because I didn't measure anything. So one I think is a little more sour. It was more liquidy because I used a freshly ground wheat flour, and that absorbs more. It absorbs more liquid, so I put more liquid in it, but then it fermented faster. So that one has a bit of a sourdough taste, but the other two don't really. Yeah.
Wow. Nice. Let's talk about fats briefly, because I know, having watched how you cook and what you cook with, that fats, ancestral fats, seem like they're still, and have been for forever, very, very important to Slovakian cuisine. Can you talk a bit about that?
Can I just backpedal, because I just remembered something about halushki.
Oh yeah, more about the dumplings.
These potato dumplings. So what is now considered the Slovak dish, the quintessential Slovak dish, is these halushki with brinza, is a sheep's cheese. Basically, just mixing potato dumplings, this soft sheep cheese, and of course bacon. And it's from the center of Slovakia, where there's a lot of sheep. Originally, they kind of came from this Romanian area. It's hilly country, so it's very nice for pasturing sheep. And in Romania, the word brinza applies to many different kinds of either cheese or soft cheese. I forget which. But in Slovakia, it just refers to this one specific type of cheese. And I describe it to people as a soft feta. So it's salty. It tastes like feta, except it's a soft cheese. And it was actually a Czech ethnographer who came and tasted this and kind of declared it the Slovak dish, because the food is so similar to the countries around it. And so what was originally just from Central Slovakia is now kind of common all over the country, and is what people, when visitors come here, you kind of say, okay, this is a Slovak dish.
So if we wanted to try and make that, we'd need the potato dumplings and bacon again, and then some sort of soft sheep's cheese, because I presume then the cheese kind of gets mixed in and kind of coats everything.
Yeah. Actually, what I've done is just taken feta and blended it up with some sour cream.
Great idea. Okay.
And and the it's kind of sharp. Again, it's that sharpness with the blandness, but the fillingness and kind of like pasta, it takes on any flavor that you pair it with. So
nice. Okay, we'll come back to some. We've got two dishes there that are very that kind of epitomise Slovakian food. We'll come back to some more. Let's diverge a bit into fats and then come back to some more dishes.
Okay. So fats in Slovakia, traditionally, many families had a pig. You made lard. Then with communism, you still had lard, but then a lot of industrial seed oils started being popular. Slovaks love deep frying food. I mean, the schnitzel is kind of an Austrian thing, I guess, and it's very, very popular here too, and it has been for a long time. Then during communism, there wasn't as much meat available. It's expensive. People didn't have money, so then they started deep frying cheese, cauliflower. Slovaks right now in the fall, Slovaks love mushroom hunting, and the parasol mushroom is kind of It's named Parasol for a reason because it kind of looks like that. It's got this wide head, flat. And if you talk to anyone, they're like, oh, the best way to eat this is deep fried. And so they call it a triple envelope. Dredge it in flour, then egg, and then breadcrumbs, and then fry it, deep fry it. And that is, so this was also a way to make, during communism, it was a way to make a cheaper food like cauliflower quite filling, because then you have the breadcrumbs and it's soaked up with all this oil. But then it wasn't lard anymore so much.
When did it stop being lard?
I would say people used lard if they had their own homemade lard. But then if they bought it, they would buy, like during communism at some point, I'm not sure what, then it was cheaper to buy industrial seed oils as the country as a whole industrialized. And farming, agriculture was centralized. And then there was kind of, the same health thing that, oh, lard's not good for you. It's not healthy. Yeah. So when I first came here, or not even first came here, until a couple years ago, there's a farmer. He works at a factory, but he keeps, a hobby farmer. He has a mangalinitsa, I think, are a heritage Hungarian breed of pig. Okay. And he has a couple of them. He butchers in the fall. And I used to be able to get a big 5 kilo container with full of lard, because nobody else wanted it. And the last couple of years I went, I was like, oh, the 5 kilo. And he's like, maybe 2 kilos, maybe 3, because there was a lot more people who wanted it.
Okay. So it's kind of coming back more there.
Yeah.
That's nice. The butchering, we talked about that a lot in the episode 23, where we focused on butchering, and there's so much in there about the dishes that come out of the butchering. We're using the whole pig. So do go back and listen to that if you haven't, because there are some really, really yummy dishes in that as well. And it's fascinating to hear, how the day progresses with butchering. So now you're able to buy lard or make it yourself still, and bacon. And do people in the cities, are they starting to use lard again, do you think? Or what's the situation now with the fats?
It's hard to say exactly because, recently in the last couple of months, for example, butter has gotten astronomically expensive. And a lard was also, this whole time, if you went to a very common, it's not really a dish, but a very common kind of snack food was bread with lard and onions. Yeah. And actually one time I had, our restaurant is the restaurant where I work is a little bit, we don't really have classic Slovak food, but this older couple came in and you could tell they were just kind of nursing their cup of wine, I think a glass of wine or two. And they looked at our menu and they said, well, do you have any bread with lard and mushrooms? And the waitress came to me and she kind of was rolling her eyes like, these people want this old Slovak food. And we're, let's say a pescatarian restaurant. We don't serve any meat. But I did have some homemade, and I said, I don't have any lard. So, and then I said, wait, in the fridge, I had this the owner had a jar of homemade goose fat. And actually that's also very popular. Homemade goose fat. And so we had this amazing bread. It was like this amazing bread. I thinly sliced. I think I had some red onions or something with this homemade goose fat and some like flaky sea salt or something. And it was like a upscale version of the original. But yes, that actually reminds me. So goose, especially this time of year, so October, November, Especially in certain areas, there's a lot of goose, and they also have an animal that's a goose duck hybrid, and yeah, they call it a goose duck in Slovakia. And I think it's kind of supposed to combine the fat and a little bit more meat. A goose doesn't actually have that much meat.
Okay.
It's supposed to have a little bit more meat, but still a lot of fat. And so both geese, ducks, and this hybrid are also popular. And my mother-in-law has a roasting pan. It's a ceramic roasting pan, and at the end there's a spout, so she roasts it, and during the roast she can pour off the fat very conveniently through the spout. And that gets used a lot for things as well, for making spreads. I'd say probably less for cooking. Like, we would think of frying and sautéing, but I would say she would use it more for on top of bread or to mix together in a spread, instead of like we would use mayo or something.
I see.
Use this goose lard.
That's what I think is interesting about the lard crackling spreads. You're going to show us one of those, and I've made a couple in my kitchen. That it actually almost is like having a mayo spread. That's the sensation I got when I made it. I made mine with some onions and garlic that I fried in lard, and then I put my leftover cracklings from lard rendering in, and then I put some hard-boiled eggs in and whisked it all up in the food processor. And it felt like an egg mayonnaise. It has that kind of unctuousness of the fat from the lard, not the mayo, and it's absolutely perfect for spreading. Really,
and it binds it together, so it's not falling apart everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. So originally, that you said that Slovakians are really into deep frying. Would that have originally all been done in lard?
Originally, yeah.
Okay. Nice. And do you deep fry in your house still?
Very little. My husband does. So I refuse to make schnitzel or anything that requires taking a piece of something and touching it 3 times then there's, I personally don't make it, not so much because I have any nutrition or health ideas about it, but because there's flour. When I make it, there's flour everywhere and breadcrumbs everywhere. And the fat we do make it in lard. And then there's fat splattered everywhere, and the smell permeates the house. But of course, it's also they make it especially for Sundays and any celebration. 99% of the time, the meal is with schnitzel. It's a very kind of, fat was a very precious thing in the past. So
special.
Yeah, you could, you made it when you slaughtered an animal, or I've seen presses for making in a Slovak village, presses for, they did a lot of flax. And this press of how they made flax oil was astounding. It was this huge room, kind of like a barn sort of thing, with these massive logs, and they had a horse that walked in a circle. And in the middle of all this huge area, that as he walked in the circle, it would press 2 logs together, and then the oil would drip from the flax seeds in the middle. So it was, and when I saw this, I thought, gosh, making oil was not an easy, simple process. It really took some dedication, both because you have to grow the plant, then harvest the seeds, then you often have to, separate, the seeds from if they have a hull or the chaff, and then you have to press it. And it requires, without machinery, it requires quite a bit of pressure.
Yeah, it must be astounding when you see that, because just diving into ancestral techniques in a modern kitchen, I can make my lard with a slow cooker, and I can just not really pay much attention to it, just in little bits during the day. And I get it from my farmer, who's the one who grows the pig and looks after that pig. And even that small act brings me much closer to, what the animal's given and the work that's gone into it. And, I'm making sure I'm using the cracklings, and we love using the lard. But to go back further to where, there would have been a smallholder with the animals, having to look after that animal all the time, or growing flax and harvesting it and separating it, and using a horse with bits of, tree that they've chopped up specially and set up. It's just astounding. And you understand why it was so precious,
Yeah. And it wasn't exactly bits of tree. It's like the log. Like these massive logs. I don't know what the diet, but it's, like I could maybe put my arm around it.
Oh, wow.
And you've got like 2 or 3 of them on a cog wheel.
Gosh. Did they eat the flax oil? Did they use it for some sort of textile thing?
That I'm not completely sure about. The flax was grown especially under the mountains. And actually on you can find on YouTube, there's he was also Czech ethnograph. In the 30s, he made a video kind of capturing, he realized that the traditional culture was going to quickly go. And so he captured on video a lot of these processes and their celebrations and dances. And the way they made linen is just very beautiful and a lot of work. So they had the fields of flax, and then these kind of twists. When they dried it, they would make these sheaves that were kind of these twist, and they twisted them so it kind of splays out from the center area. And so then you have these mountains in the background with this field full of twisty sheaves, and those would dry. Then you have to soak them in the water and pound them and soak them again. I forget the whole process, but so linen was also used as a fabric in that area, especially. The oil I'm not, I think they ate it, but I'm not really 100% sure.
Flax was grown historically in Italy as well, and someone I know who lives relatively close to me is starting to grow it again. And I keep meaning to go back and kind of understand how it was used, because I know that some oils, for example, doing my olive oil research that I've done the last year, a lot of the olive oil that went to England before olive oil became popular as a food was sent to England in order to lubricate sheep's wool, so it could be made into spinning yarn. Because lanolin wasn't enough, apparently they used olive oil. And it's just interesting how all these things kind of link together. There's food and there's cloth and there's things to help processes along the way. And it's just amazing that everything had a purpose and there was nothing wasted. Everything had something it was supposed to help create life and all the things needed for life.
Yeah, and you didn't use just all the parts of the animal, but also all the parts of the plant.
Yeah, completely.
When I first heard Alison talking about boza, the fermented drink made of millet that's a household name in Turkey, I felt as if I was being transported back to a bazaar in the Ottoman Empire or traveling the Silk Road on the back of a camel, and I knew I wanted to taste it. Boza is fizzy, sweet, tart, and it's full of probiotics. You can drop it into your smoothies, spoon it on top of your breakfast, or drink it in the traditional way they still do in Istanbul, topped with cinnamon and toasted chickpeas. Fermented millet drinks were first made in that region of Europe in the 8th century BC, and as with all of Alison's courses, she's gone above and beyond in research and experimentation and testing on Rob and Gabe, and given us an easy way to recreate the goodness in our own homes. If you'd like a fun and tasty way to get more probiotics into your life, bring her into your kitchen and have her walk you through how to bring this ancestral dairy-free, gluten-free fermentation recipe with her amazing Boza video course. Head to www.ancestralkitchen.com/boza, BOZA, to check out the video course. And happy fermentation.
Let's talk about some more food. So tell us something. You talked about kind of special days and, you know, Christmas and celebrations. There would always be these deep fried things. Tell us some more about like what would be a traditional, for example, Sunday dish for Slovakian or traditional festivity dish.
So Sunday lunch is a really big thing here. It's and I'm not sure if it started before communism, but certainly, I mean, it's traditionally a very religious culture, so Sunday would have been religiously significant. But especially during communism, during the work week, you did not have time to sit around much as a family. When the factories started, then they had, they provided foods in cafeterias. So it's still now it's common that during the work week you have your lunch. Nobody takes lunch to work, or very few people take lunch to work. That would be kind of a modern thing. It's more cafeterias, or a lot of these, we call them buffets, where they serve kind of cafeteria style. So Sunday lunch was really a time. It's such a family-oriented culture, and so that was a day to be together with your family. And again, not until recently, not a lot of innovation. Very classically, you have a bone soup, often chicken, not necessarily. Then roast chicken or pork, could be baked or deep fried schnitzel, potatoes or rice, and then served together with the main meal, not as a dessert, canned fruit. Often it's especially this part of Slovakia is quite warm, so you can have apricots and plums and cherries, etc. And and there's not, I remember talking to a student, we were talking about food and blah, blah, blah. She was my kid's age. And I said, okay, what about, Sunday lunch? What do you have? Okay, it's a little bit limited because her mother is celiac, but she said, yeah, we have chicken and rice. I was like, anything other than chicken and rice? Sometimes potatoes. And that was every Sunday. It's roasted chicken with rice, and a lot of families are like that.
Is that what you do?
No.
What do you do?
I do try and make a bone, not in the super hot months, because in the summer it's just too hot to have a pot of bones bubbling away on the stove. But as it gets cooler, then some kind of bone or collection of bones, chicken, beef, pork, doesn't really matter. And they're raw. They are not in online. When you find advice for making broths or stocks, it always says, roast them first. This is no. This is, a Slovak will look at you like you're crazy if you roast them first. If I started taking, bones from a goose or a turkey to make soup with, and they're like, what are you doing? You don't make soup from that. And it's not the kind of broth that gels. It's much more watery. It cooks maybe 3-4 hours. And you want something with a little bit of fat to give it more flavor. And then you put in whole carrots, parsley root, maybe odds and ends of other things for flavor. And then they serve it with these very thin egg noodles. And you take out the whole carrot or parsley root and chop it up when it's already cooked, and put it in the soup bowl, and then ladle the broth over top, ideally a little fresh parsley on top. And so I do that. For Sunday, I will often do some kind of meat, but it really varies. When my husband feels like it, he will make schnitzel, but that is his domain, not mine. Okay. And it's also what we were talking about, the practice in your hands. He actually the high school system here, he went to a vocational high school for cooking. And so one time we did cheese together, and his cheese envelopes, as they call them, were uniform, perfectly, looked lovely. And mine, I did the same thing, and they were all kind of lumpy and blotchy and didn't look nearly as nice. It's hard. It's hard to find meat that I'm satisfied with the sourcing of. And so once a year we get a large deer from a hunter. And I always love it when I have that, when I can pull that out of the freezer. And sometimes a roast, sometimes medallions. And then, I guess I kind of follow often I'll follow similar, then also have like potatoes or rice or some sort of other carbohydrate dish.
And what about green vegetables and stuff on the side? Is that a traditional thing as well or not?
Not really. Vegetables were not a huge part of. There's lettuces. Like my mother-in-law, she would the lettuce salad she would make would be like kind of lettuce is common here, but the types of salad that they make from them is somewhat limited. So it was actually in like water. It was like a sweet. She put maybe like some sugar and salt in water, and then you like dish it. And they actually cooked it. There's a soup, which my students have told me is like their most hated soup is a lettuce soup. It's like a creamy, milky soup, and then there'd be like chopped up lettuce. And I remember my students saying like, "Oh my gosh, this is the worst dish ever."
And what about drinking? Traditionally with that roast, is there wine or is it beer? What's the traditional kind of drink?
That really depends on the area of Slovakia you're in. So in the west and south, where it's hotter and flatter, there's big wine, lots of wine. It's not that well known outside of Slovakia, but the wine making, kind of artisan wine making, has really increased. The town that I work in, it's a pretty small town, but all around it are vineyards, and there's so many winemakers there for such a small area, or for such a small kind of urban center. And beer is popular everywhere, and then hard alcohols are also popular everywhere, but especially the more north and east you go. The more they make it and drink it.
Because the landscape's different, or because it's colder?
So they can't grow grapes, but they can grow, for example, like plums. Plums will grow even where it's fairly chilly, and that's slivovica. So anything that ends with they take the name of the fruit and then they put an "ica" at the end. So apricot ica, I guess it's brandy. They call it burning it. You burn apricots, pears, plums, what else? Pretty much any fruit. And the smell is incredible. Plums is the most popular and also probably my least personal favorite. But apricots or pear, if you have a good homemade one, if you buy it in the store, it's got, aromas or whatever in it.
Yeah.
But a good homemade one that's kind of cured for a little bit, you open up a bottle in the middle of winter and it's the smell of summer. It's the smell of ripe fruit in summer. Beautiful. And then you taste it. It does not taste like ripe fruit in summer, but there is.
Blows you away.
Yes. Yeah. It's generally between 50 to 52% alcohol. So it's really strong.
Wow. Okay.
And they're not, maybe some people now as a modern thing would mix it, but in general, nobody mixes it. You just drink a little shot of it straight. And the important thing is then afterwards, there's this kind of sweetness from the fruit. And that's the mark of if it goes down smoothly, and if it's the aftertaste if you can get a fruity aftertaste. But I am by far not a pizza drink connoisseur.
Sounds good. We haven't talked about bread, and I know I didn't necessarily prime you to talk about bread, but just listening to all of this, I'm just thinking, the bread. What about bread? Because obviously, I love bread. Tell me about bread there.
Bread is the Slovak staple. It is. It's the backbone of the country, really, in terms of food. Yeah, it's not considered a Slovak food because it's not different than the rest of Europe, but it's not unique to Slovakia like bryndzové halušky is. But it is like the backbone, working backbone of the country. And in fact, traditionally to guests, and still if there's like an important guest comes and the government, an official visit, they offer bread and salt. That's the gift that you offer people when they come. And every anytime you have visitors or some big event going on, there's always, so the word for bread is chlieb, and the word for these open-faced sandwiches is chlebičky, like these little breads, like a diminutive of the word bread. And you can't go to any older person is what they always serve, and it's a piece of bread, butter or mayonnaise, a little bit of ham, a piece of some sort of vegetable. So it might be like a little bit of tomato or pepper or radish, or depends on the season, and a pickle, and then finely grated cheese over top of that. And this is, or even if in the winter, even canned peppers, like kind of canned in oil. And and this is like ubiquitous, and it's both everywhere and essential to Slovak food. So if we don't have bread in the house, my husband's like, "Do we have bread?" Like he's like almost panics if we don't have bread.
Yeah, no, I'm like that too. Is it the kind of the same as what happened in the rest of Europe, in that generally a whole grain bread was associated traditionally with peasantry, and then because it took money and process to sieve the bread, white bread was associated with aristocracy? Is that the same?
Yeah, I think so. But here, the white, fluffy, crustless bread never took on the same popularity or acceptance as in other Western countries. It's here, and people use it for toast, not for making toast, but what they call toast, like a sandwich, like a hot sandwich. They call this toasting. So you would, whatever in the middle, and you put it in a hot press, and this is what they call toast. I don't even know what the word is in English. So they use that kind of bread for that, but generally just what people ate never became the fluffy, substanceless bread. They always had.
So what's the normal loaf traditionally for a Slovakian then?
They've always had lots of different kinds.
Okay.
Sometimes, but a basic wheat loaf, not particularly heavy like a rye. They have ones mixed with rye that are heavier, but not like 100%. Like my sister-in-law from Belarus will bring back like these very sturdy, heavy loaves of rye bread, and they didn't do that. It was lighter than that, but yeah, so wheat and rye, often caraway seeds in it, which I don't particularly care for myself. Flax seeds in it.
Okay.
And then for sweets, they would do a lot of yeasted doughs. So not necessarily like bread, but various desserts. I don't know what to call it. It's not a dessert, and it's more like for example, my mother-in-law, so it's religious country, mostly Catholic and some Protestant. And so Wednesdays and Fridays were meatless.
Okay.
And my mother-in-law would, and still does, make a soup and then bake a yeasted something every Wednesday and Friday. My husband said it was like clockwork, and some sort of vegetable soup, maybe some beans in it, and halushki. And then, the yeasted food could be either sweet or savory.
Okay. Traditionally, would it have always been kind of yeasted? Do you know about a time before commercial yeast? Was it yeast from kind of beer, or was it sourdough? What's the tradition there?
I think before commercial yeast, it would have been sourdough, but and also, well, it would have been sourdough, and then in recent years, sourdough has really experienced a resurgent here as well. But in my mother-in-law's generation, nobody had sourdough, but they bought fresh yeast. It wasn't dry, but it was like fresh yeast cakes. Yeah. And even when you think in sweets, when someone has, for example, a wedding, or they're planning an event and they want to be fancy, I guess, or nicer, there's all these kinds of sweets that I've heard come more from Austria, and I don't actually particularly like them. To me, they're a little bit tasteless, but I love the traditional, like what the original Slovak sweets were. So, it'll be a sweeter yeasted dough with poppy seeds or tomato, curds, cheese curds, and not cheese curds. Yeah, curds, or nuts. And,
sounds nice.
And even Go on. I mean, I can talk about Slovak yeasted items for a while, because there's a lot. But the other thing they do also a lot is to steam it. So there's what you bake in the oven, and then there's also buchti is buns, and knedla is like a loaf shape, and then you steam it. And when I first came here, I thought it was like raw bread. I was like, wow, what is this white loaf here? But no, it's steamed. And then the buns, they usually eat, they often eat sweet. So my kids will get at the cafeteria, like sprinkled with, they'll eat it together with jam or cocoa powder with some sugar, or, butter, melted butter on top. But the knedla, the loaf ones, they slice it and they'll eat it warm with a lot of kind of stewy things and then they use. It's really good for soaking. It soaks up juices better than a baked loaf of bread. Yeah. And so they'll.
I've never steamed bread. Have you tried it?
I haven't myself. No, I'm a little bit intimidated by it, but basically I've seen my mother-in-law do it, and she has quite a fairly big pot, because these are truly loaf shaped. They're like a loaf of bread, and she puts over top of the pot, she ties a like a muslin cloth. It's thicker than a cheesecloth, but usually she calls it a diaper, because it's what they would have used for cloth diapers. Yeah. And she ties it so that it's the right tension. You want it enough to kind of sag down a little bit over the water, but tight enough to hold the loaf. And boiling water underneath, puts a lid on top. And I have a few friends who make it, because they say, of course, like what they make themselves is always better than the store. But most people buy it from the store now.
I think I probably have a go at the steaming soon, because I'm reading Dorothy Hartley's Food in England book, and there are a lot of steamed puddings that are traditionally English in that book, because people didn't have ovens with doors and heat that could radiate like that. They had the fire or the hob, and So steaming was absolutely necessary, to produce a range of goods.
Yeah.
So there's lots of steamed
Oh,
pudding.
I never thought of that.
Steamed
Yeah.
pies and that kind of thing. So probably sometime with my experiments with this Food in England book, I'm going to have a go at steaming. I remember my nan steaming puddings in England when I was very, very young. And I've never tried to recreate it, but I'm probably going to give it a go.
Okay. Well, as the price of electricity goes up here, I will probably be a good idea to try some fire steam dishes over the fire outside.
Over the fire, yeah. I'd like to see that. I'd like to see some pictures of it.
I really should try this. It didn't even occur to me before. So now I have something new to aim for.
Is there anything that you want to talk about that we haven't yet before we head over into your kitchen and see you make some goodies for us?
I mean, I can talk about food for a long time, so.
And you'll have to come back.
Yeah.
Explain to people where you are, where your website is, because there are some beautiful photos and lots of recipes on there. So tell people where they can find you.
So I have a blog that I haven't written on for a long time, but most of the content is evergreen. So recipes are good anytime. I would love to be more active there, but it was a hobby and haven't had time recently for the amount of time that goes into it. So it's called almostbananas.net.
Okay, net.
Yeah. And also on Instagram, that's where I'm most active these days, mostly in the stories. Just sharing pictures of daily life. And that's where you can find me.
What's your Instagram handle?
Almost Bananas.
So the same. Okay.
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, I'd recommend trying out some of Naomi's recipes. I post a lot about the liver pate recipe, which is now my staple liver pate recipe that I make. It's written for beef. You wrote it for beef, didn't you? But I use it for my pork.
Yeah, so well. I originally saw it for pork, but I had a lot of beef liver, so I used it for beef, and I was just shocked at how it rendered it got rid of that kind of beef liver taste that people don't like. And and I learned that from the butcher. That was
I didn't know that.
Yeah, from the Slovak butcher that comes to my parents-in-law, or came to my parents-in-law when they had a pig butchering. And I saw him put allspice in, and I was like, that's curious. And then I kind of saw, like, they always have, when they do this pig butchering, they have a ton of, at the very beginning, they saute a bunch of onions and use it in various dishes. And I kind of watched what he did, like, okay, lots of sauteed onions, the ground up liver, cooked. I think the liver was cooked. Yeah, because it's cooked in these cauldrons. If you listen to the episode about the pig butchering, you'll know what I'm talking about for people. So it's cooked. The liver's cooked in this cauldron, and then he grinds it up, like puts it through a meat grinder, and put this allspice in. And I was intrigued, so I tried it at home, and that was the result.
It works. Yeah, it works. So that recipe is on there, which I'd totally recommend. And there are lots of other recipes and lovely photos. And you can actually see the landscape where you're living through your Instagram stories, because you're posting a lot of landscape up there. So it really gives a sense of where you are, which is beautiful. Thank you. Okay. Well, we shall head over to your kitchen now. And I'm really excited to see how to make the strapachki and this lard crackling. So thank you ever so much for your time again, Naomi. And it's been really inspiring and educational to listen to you. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Bye for now.
Bye.
Thank you so much for listening. We'd love to continue the conversation. Come find us on Instagram. Andrea's at Farm and Hearth, and Alison's at Ancestral_kitchen. Until next time, we both wish you much fun, exploration and satisfaction in and out of the kitchen.